Professor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Matthew. My name is Shmuel Feiner. I live in Jerusalem. I'm a graduate of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and I teach for the last 30 years at Bar-Ilan University, which is next to Tel Aviv. I am an historian of the Jewish people in the modern time, especially in Europe, specializing in the Jewish Enlightenment, secularization, and other topics that I may have the chance to speak about later. And I also the chairperson of the Historical Society of Israel. This is the main organization of all historians in Israel. We're very, very active. We consider ourselves as a superpower in history, and those of you who are interested, in 2026, just around the corner, hopefully post-corona time, we are going to host the International Congress of Historians from all over the world. The ICHS organization elected Israel, especially Jerusalem, as the host for this conference. I would like also to add, this is part of my identity and my profession as an historian, that I consider myself a historian who has only one question, but a very big question. And the question is how to decipher the code, I would say, of Jewish modernization. So we may have the opportunity to talk about it later in this conversation.
Right. Well, thank you very much for that, Professor. That's a good segue, actually, to my first question. I'm looking forward to picking your brain on these really big questions. So, my first thought I'd love to start off with is, what was the main focus or concern of the Jews in the 18th century, particularly in Europe?
Yeah. Okay. You might find it surprising that the Jewish people in the 18th century was a tiny minority, around 1.1 million at 1700 and 2.4 million in the year 18,000. And that means that everywhere in the world where you could find Jewish communities, they were very, very small. And this, of course, experience of being a tiny minority, a tiny Jewish minority in the environment of a Christian majority was, of course, very powerful and had a lot of impact on the Jewish experience and Jewish history. Because in most places, this tiny majority lived under discriminating rules. They were excluded from many things. They couldn't, for example, have property. They couldn't purchase land. They were restricted to certain professions, and they lived in autonomous communities in the atmosphere of a religious culture, and most of them lived in Eastern Europe. So you couldn't see many Jews if you travel around Western Europe, maybe in Amsterdam, almost none in Paris, but in Poland and Lithuania, there were many Jewish communities. In some places, Jews even were the majority in those places. There were only very, very few thousands in Palestine. There were very few in America at the time, maybe 1,000-2,000, and of course, all these numbers changed dramatically in the 19th and 20th century. And I would like to add that most Jews in the 18th century actually lived in constant struggle for survival. Most of them were poor, and they had sometimes to travel from one place to another. There were groups of beggars in the forest of Europe. There were even criminals among them, Jewish gangs. And on the other side, there was a tiny class of rich people who actually took care of the communities. They were the people who could provide the poor people, who could help them, and they had sometimes good connections with the governments, with princes, even with popes, and with military commanders, and their fortune actually was very helpful for the entire community.
Right.
And yes, please.
That's very interesting.
Yes.
That's a lot. I mean, I think that's more for me. I think you've enlightened my understanding of the European Jewry in the 18th century more than any textbook has, really. I mean, there's not much. There's no one source that I could name that I have read where I say, oh, I know that. That's a real deep impact, and it's a deeper understanding of the dispersion too, and of the lifestyles too, of the complex lifestyles of the European Jewry. What contributed then to the growth of the population, because from the tight-knit communities too?
Yeah, well, first of all, the entire population of Europe was growing in the 18th century from around 110 million to 180 million. So the population increase of Jews was part of it. But in the 18th century, we could already see the first signs of modernization. And that's, of course, helped also the Jewish minority. I would like to indicate the two most significant, actually, trends in the 18th century. From the side of the state, the absolutist, the centralist state started to interfere in the autonomous life of the Jews, aspiring for more control over the entire population, including the minority. And they, in few places, also introduce plans for reform in the life of the Jews. And the main, items on the agenda of those reforms were how to improve the economic life of the Jews, to let them do things that they were forbidden previously, to let them, for example, send those children to schools, to general schools, to Christian schools, in order to enable them, when they grow up, to have more profitable professions. The best example, of course, was the reforms of Joseph II, the ruler of the Habsburg Empire, who introduced in his tolerance patent, in his decrees of tolerance to the Jews in his under his control, very significant reforms concerning economic, concerning education, and also ignoring some religious rules that restricted the Jews. He didn't, of course, give up his Catholic belief, but he was a lot more tolerant.
Right.
And he actually believed that sometimes the benefit, the welfare of the state is more important than the glorification of God. So this is one significant change that happened in the 18th century. And the second significant change was more internal. the traditional world that was as described, the religious life, autonomous life in the Jewish community, this world was challenged from few directions in the 18th century. And under the first signs of secularization, the community started to disintegrate, and people came out and said, well, we want to express ourselves as individuals, as people who deserve their own life, who can have control over their own life, and not under the strict supervision of the community. And this was the beginning of what I call the Jewish Kulturkampf, the cultural conflicts inside the Jewish community. So I believe that those two big challenges were starting to change the traditional pattern of Jewish life in the 18th century.
Right. Now that might lead into the following question then. Then what I was going to, the follow-up then would be, what significant event or events impacted the European Jewry in the 18th century that had a positive or negative impact, rippling effects till today? Would that have been one of the positive effects, the idea of self as an individual, not autonomous individual in the world, and able to determine your own life, separate from the community?
Yes, if you're asking about events, there are many significant events in the 18th century that had an important impact, and some of those events are still with us today. It means it's the implications.
Right.
And I would like to indicate two events, one from Berlin, one from Paris. The one from Berlin happened in the year 1778, when the Freischule, the first modern Jewish school, was established in Berlin by few rich Jews, philanthropists, and few intellectuals and educators. This was a revolution. Until 1778, Jewish education was in the hands of rabbis. The text, the ideas, the goals of education, everything was around religion. So the main purpose of traditional education was the transfer tradition from one generation to another. Right. And that's all. And now, the first time, a school was established, not a cheder or Talmud Torah, two Hebrew words for traditional institutions, and school was planned according to modern outlines. It means classes, curriculum, not just religious texts, but also what was called in the Jewish vocabulary of the time as external knowledge. That means subjects which are outside religion, outside the traditional text, and everything is included in those external subject. It could be mathematics, algebra, it could be geography, history, and literature, and everything. So that's a major change in the curricula. But when this first school was established, and that was the first out of many were going to be established later in the 1780s and so on and so forth, this modern school also changed actually the ideal of the good Jew. What is the ideal Jew? Because if the traditional education was aimed to create the ideal type of the Talmid Chacham, the scholar, the Talmudist, the rabbi who can learn the Talmud by himself, for example, Now, this idea would change. It wasn't abandoned, but it was restricted just to several people who would like to take this pattern in life.
Right.
But for all the others, the idea became more practical to enable the young students to have a proper profession, to make a living, and to enable people to continue with the studies, those who are talented, and go to the gymnasium, that's in Germany, or maybe even more. So this wasn't a neutral revolution, because from the very beginning, there was an opposition to this kind of modern schools. So the impact is enormous, but not just the positive impact, but also the negative, because until the 21st century, until today, the conflict between modern knowledge or secular knowledge or external knowledge and religious knowledge, we still live inside these conflicts because the Jewish society today, from the 19th century and 20th century, is divided. And I'm going to elaborate a little more about it later.
Right. No, that's well, that I have a thought that comes to mind then, right? That is, which probably leads into my third question, actually. But does that mean that with these change, this change of the external knowledge is being flourishing, and the desire to mathematics, chemistry, physics, and so forth, does that create, perhaps still, but in modernity, a conflict within the Jewry itself, a conflict?
Yes, you're right. But
like a kind of fight within the family, as it were.
Yes. But let me just, before I'm going to and to elaborate on this point, I promised to mention the second event. So this was the event that happened in Berlin, 1778. Now I'm going to Paris, to September 1791, when the General Assembly of the French Revolution voted, after a stormy debate, for the emancipation law, for the law that gives to individual Jews the right to be French citizens, with full rights, for all the everything that is entailed in being a French citizen. That was the first time that a parliament in Europe or anywhere in the world voted in a democratic meeting. Of course, it wasn't so democratic as we know, but still there was a voting, and the majority voted for the emancipation. But what makes this event also revolutionary, with much impact, was not just this particular law that granted the possibility, the chance for being a French Jew to certain French Jews, because the community in France was very, very small at the time. There were about 45,000 Jews in France in total, and that's really a fraction of the French population, and even the Jewish population. But what made it important is the debate, not just the resolution, but the debate, because in the debate, we could already hear the arguments for or against the Jews when it comes to being citizens, that constituted part of the famous Jewish question that became a constant question in Europe from the French Revolution All along the 19th century and even the 20th century, as we know, when it comes to the Nazi Germany, they wanted to solve the Jewish question. So the Jewish question started already in the debate in General Assembly of the French Revolution, where when the supporters of the Jews argued that there is no way to deny the Jews their lawful rights because we rely on abstract notions of tolerance, of freedom, of looking at each man as a human being and putting all the other attributes of religion, ethnicity, and other things aside. But those who were against emancipation, they argued that the Jews cannot change. We know their nature. We know their nature from the past. France, of course, is now not a Catholic state officially, but still we have those notions about the Jews. And another argument that became very prominent in the debate over the Jewish questions over generation, and was also one of the anti-Semitic slogans, that the Jews are a state in a state, and we cannot actually tolerate a state inside our state. Now that we are establishing a new state, abolishing the rule of the monarch and the feudalism, so how can we accept Jewish autonomy? So the price for emancipation was dismantling the communities, dismantling actually the collective identity of the Jews, because this emancipation was granted only for the Jews as individuals, not as a community. All those arguments became very prominent in the future. They gave, some weapons to anti-Semites, but also gave the arguments for those who really believe the Jews can be part of the citizenship of the states.
That's impressive. Yeah, I hear it how you describe that, Professor. I can hear that. I can hear how someone could use that to weaponize it, but also use it to really step back and think about it more deeply and richly, intellectually. You see the ripple effects subsequently in the 19th century, the 20th century, the ripple effects from that too. This might be a good time to ask the follow-up question, the third question. Within these goings on, then, the conflicts, the identity of the European Jewry. How did, correct me please if I'm pronouncing this incorrectly, is Hashoshana, how did that come about during that time with the Jewish Enlightenment period? How did that come about? What was going on? What kind of ardor, intellectual spark? Was it the conflicts itself that brought it about? Like what epiphany happened? And I presume it wasn't an overnight thing, but what happened externally, especially externally, to have that Hashoshana come about?
Yeah, well, this is an important and crucial question when we come to the Jewish 18th century, talking about the Jewish Enlightenment, or in the Hebrew word Haskalah, a word that comes from sechel, from reason, actually. So in the Hebrew term, they didn't take the motive of light, as in the English or the German, enlightenment or Aufklärung, but they took the motive of reason. So the Haskalah was the the Jewish Enlightenment, or the Enlightenment of the Jews. As we know now, there are many national enlightenments in plural. There's a Polish and Scottish and British and French and Dutch, and also there is also a Jewish Enlightenment. That means that those Jews who consider themselves part of the Enlightenment of the 18th century shared most of the values of the philosophers, of the writers of the time. On the other hand, they, of course, had their own problems. They had, for example, their own ways of expression. Just give you one example. One of the goals of the Jewish enlighteners, the Maskilim, was the revival of the Hebrew language. The Hebrew language wasn't a spoken language until very late, until the end of the 19th century. That was the part of Zionism, actually, making Hebrew a spoken language. So Hebrew was a sacred language. It was the language of the scholars. It was almost like Latin for the Christians. On one difference that even young children were taught Hebrew not in order to understand the language and to use it, but in order to be able to recite the prayers or to read the Torah, to read from the Bible. So one of the goals of the Maskilim, the Jewish enlighteners, was to modernize the Hebrew language and to make it a modern language that is usable also for writing science, for writing poetry, for writing literature. So that was an important evolution that makes the Jewish Enlightenment unique. And of course, they were dealing with some problems that were particular for the Jewish minority. And the Haskalah started, and it's based on my research and on my book, The Jewish Enlightenment. It started with a very interesting, and it's sometimes very difficult to even explain, attraction, sometimes even erotic attraction of frustrated young Jewish men who realize that their world, their cultural world, is limited. They were graduates of the traditional education institution, as we've just mentioned. So all they actually acquired in their education was mastering religious texts, mastering the Torah, mastering Jewish law, or mastering the Talmud, sometimes the Kabbalah. But they looked around and they realized that something astonishing and very exciting is going on outside the borders of their culture, of the community. And they were even seduced by this external knowledge, by science, by philosophy. And of course, it wasn't so easy for those first Maskilim, first enlighteners, first young Jews who started this project of Jewish enlightenment to acquire this external knowledge. Some of them, very few, were students. Because if, as you know, maybe you don't, it's important to emphasize part of the restrictions, this system of restricting the Jews from many things. One of them was the academia. Jews could not actually join the academia, couldn't study in the universities. Some of the universities, of course, were still religious institutions, and we can understand why they were restricted. But in the late 17th century, medical faculties were opened up for the Jews. So we have very fascinating testimonies from Jewish students who came to the university, who came to the European University, mainly in Germany, but also in Italy, and they were astonished. They said, well, we didn't know that this exists at all. How can we actually be part of it? And then when they became part of it and they graduated and became medical doctors themselves, they asked themselves, how can we change the culture of the Jews? How can we, take this, our own experience and make it something more general, and to reform the Jewish society by introducing these seductive knowledge. And this is the beginning of the Jewish Enlightenment, because from then on, they and others started this project of publishing translations in science or philosophy or literature, and they organized the first time in 1783 in Königsberg. A few students and private tutors, they organized the first, let's say, movement, and they published a periodical, which was the first Hebrew periodical in the world. And this was a very significant revolution in my mind when we look at the several patterns of Jewish modernization, because what happened was not just the periodical, but those who contributed, those who edited, became engaged intellectuals from a very different kind, a kind that didn't exist until that moment in Jewish history. Not rabbis, not Kabbalists, not Talmudists, but writers, poets, journalists, meaning a secular intellectual who challenge the rabbinical elite.
Right. I mean, right there too, because you see the conflict right there too, like a building of a conflict. I like this too. I like how this. I like the energy. I like the use that you said, the seduction of like an external knowledge of medicine, of literature, of philosophy, and formulating new philosophies, new outlooks, new methodologies. But is there at that moment too? At that moment, is that conflict that we're previously talking? Is that when it starts to build? Is that when it starts to build to those who are more traditional, let's say, and those who were embracing modernity but still staying true to, like, as you might say, maybe a Jewish identity, but adding more to the identity, to a personal identity, adding more to what they were. So whether it's literature, philosophy, politics, perhaps adding more to their own identity, while still keeping true to an overarching identity.
Yes, of course. The opponents of the masculine accused them of abandoning Jewish identity. But of course, the reality wasn't like that at all. And the best example is Moses Mendelssohn. Because Moses Mendelssohn is usually identified as the major figure of the Jewish Enlightenment. He actually had these, let's say, double life. At least from the outside, because he combined a very deep Jewish identity. He was an observant Jew, and he kept all the commandments, and he was a believer. He actually argued against atheists and deists of his time. On the other hand, he was a rationalist. He was an amazing philosopher who had many contacts in the European network of scholars and philosophers. We know that he traveled to Königsberg. He lived in Berlin, by the way, but he traveled sometimes to Königsberg and to meet Immanuel Kant, and they were very good friends there. So he could live in both worlds, in the Jewish world as a community member, as an observant religious Jew well, talking in our terms, but on the other hand, he was the best friend of Lessing, and he could write about everything in the world of philosophy. He translated Rousseau into German, and many other things. That means that combination that you mentioned, this, let's say, hybrid identity, being modern but not losing your Jewish identity,
Right, yeah.
and even arguing that your Jewish identity actually requires also being part of the world as
Right.
a human
And
being.
that seems almost so radical too. That seems like such a radical position to take too, like for the time especially. But such not, but still, I mean, even today, by today's standards, that's something that's a radical position for the individual to take too.
Yeah, it's not easy.
Yeah.
Yes, it's one of the conflicts, I think, that and that's one of the impacts of the 18th century on our time too, because we also have those dilemmas of identity,
Right.
and sometimes we know Jews who are dressed in East European clothing.
Right.
They call themselves Orthodox. Sometimes we call them ultra-Orthodox. We call them Hasidim. We can see them in many places in the world, and we wonder, are they the authentic Jews? Because this is how a Jew should be look like. That's the alternative Jew. But this is, of course, not true, because those people chosen only to take the Jewish identity and to ignore and even to negate the challenges of the modern world. And this is today, this trend, those ultra-Orthodox people called sometimes in Hebrew Haredim, they are the minority, but still this minority reminds us constantly the basic conflict,
Right.
and the challenge, and the several, responses to the same challenge.
Absolutely. No, that's a good framework. That's a good perspective. I like how you put that, Professor. I like how you put that. That even though they're a minority, that nevertheless they remind us of the conflict still. That's a really good perspective on it. I've never had somebody describe it to me that way. I like that. That's a really good perspective. I like that a lot, actually, because it makes intellectual sense to me. I can conceptualize that. That makes sense to me. That's a really good perspective. That's really interesting too. And I'm reminded too of even of Mendelssohn's son too, Felix too, and the contributions he made too, that even just to music alone. But that's impressive as well. I mean, it shows to me that that
grandson,
right, grandson. Thank you.
Yes.
That shows me how impactful, but how cross-generational it was too. I mean, it's a period which I think, whether Jew, whether secular, whether a person of faith or not, just a human being in the world. This is a period that allows you to understand a lot more of your fellow human beings and how they think and what came about, and it allows you to get to deeper questions. The 18th century, from the 18th century Jewry and what was going on, and these are big questions. And I think these are questions that I think a lot of people need to study more, not just in academia, but there's so many things that are popularized, let's say in science, or popularized in history. This is a period that should really be on the forefront of our understanding for a lot of people. It's such a very significant period for a lot of reasons, for a lot of events, but particularly for the European Jewry.
Let me just contribute another dimension to this conflicting time of the 18th century. I mentioned Hasidim. The Hasidim emerged in the 18th century. They're not part of traditional Jewry. That was part of what I believe was at the time a global phenomenon.
Right.
Century was not just the age of enlightenment, not just the age of reason. That was also the age of religious revivalism. In Europe, Germany, Moravian brothers, in America, of course, the Great Awakening.
Absolutely.
That's also the 18th century. And Hasidism was the Jewish version of the Great Awakening. That was a version of religious revivalism. Kabbalists in Eastern Europe who organize communities, voluntary communities around charismatic religious leaders. They call them tzaddikim, and they believe that they powers. They believe that they can help each individual in his private life, and those communities became a challenge to the established communities, to the leaders of the community. So it was religious in nature, but it was already modern in its form and in its challenges. So Hasidism emerged in parallel to the Jewish Enlightenment. So at the same time that the Hasidim actually preach for becoming more devoted, to become closer to God, Moses Mendelssohn, who was, again, a committed Jew, observant Jew, he could say the following about religious tolerance, because this is in his soul. This was the main thing that actually encouraged him to go to the public sphere and fight for his principle.
Right.
And I just have one citation when he said against the excommunication, against religious excommunication from religious community. He says, I keep silent regarding the danger entailed by according such a right of excommunication for its misuse, as with any ecclesiastical punishment or power is unavoidable. He said, in a few centuries, the human race will not yet recover from this monster of fanaticism. Yeah. So this sounds very modern. He was could
have been written and said today. Yeah.
Yes. So you can see the contradiction, and those things happen at the same time.
Wow. It's funny. I mean, I've enjoyed the works of Mendelssohn, his perspectives. I find largely because they're so rich and they're so rich in modernity, but they're also rich in the kind of a departmentalizing. He can be more than one thing, and I think that shows that. Well, as any human, we're walking ambiguities. We're very ambiguous in how we are. We can be multiple things at any given time. We can play many roles. And he did play many roles. He did play many roles, significant roles too. And what, as you say, what was in his heart, what was in his soul, those were preeminent thoughts. Those were preeminent. And he was I think he was a force to be reckoned with, an intellectual force.
Absolutely, yes.
I wonder too, I think we touched on it briefly, but what were a few main or what were a few main arguments, intellectual arguments that were conversations that were going on in the state to discuss the future of the European Jewry? What were the intellectuals talking about? I mean, I think we may have touched on this briefly, but what were the discussions going on, the arguments of the intellectuals in Europe at the time?
Yeah, I think that the main issue is tolerance. Right. We can start with John Locke already in his epistles about toleration in late 17th century. He was one of the first, actually, philosophers who included the Jews in the broader concept of religious tolerance. Why can't we, the Christian state, give them their the rights? Because there is no connection should be between being a good citizen and believing in something, because belief is kept for the personal, the private decision. And then another argument which became very popular came out a century later by Moses Mendelssohn, good friend, by Lessing, in this famous drama, Nathan der Weise, Nathan the Wise from 1779. What the audience or the reader of this drama could learn, they could learn that true friendship between a Jew, a Muslim, and a Christian can happen. It's not something that is impossible, because, as Lessing argues in this drama, in Nathan the Wise, because the identity of the man, of the human being as a human being, is prior to any other identities. It means it's above, it's more general than the particular religious or national identity. But on the other hand, we shouldn't describe and paint this picture in pink colors, because it wasn't like that at all. Because in the 17th, 18th century, also an anti-Jewish attitudes were developed by intellectuals, and some of them serious and important. For example, alongside John Locke, there were English deists who studied the Bible, and studied the Bible as a book of history, not a book of revelation. And they took out from the Bible the attribute of the Jews, and they described the Jews as barbaric nation who did terrible things in ancient times, and maybe this is the real character. This is the real character of the Jews, not just in ancient times, not just in biblical times, but maybe also in our own times. It means they judged the Jewish people and also the Jewish religion by new modern standards, not religious, not theological standards, but by rational and moral standards, and the outcome was very negative. And those arguments of the days were adapted by the most important figure in the French Enlightenment, and that's Voltaire. Voltaire, in his writings, he continued the deist, and he also studied the Bible, and he, in his cynical way, said that the Jews are so, terrible, and they did such gross and cruel deeds in the past, and that means that we cannot trust them, we cannot include them in the civil society at all. And some of those arguments were also heard in the debate over the emancipation of the Jews in the General Assembly in revolutionary France. So when I said earlier that the Jewish question emerged in the 18th century, I also meant the several variations and several arguments for and against the Jews. And we're talking about secular arguments, actually, political, moral, rational, not theological anymore. That means secularization didn't necessarily bring emancipation, bring tolerance, but it could also brought some negative attitudes towards the Jews.
Right, and in many ways, perhaps more visceral forms of hatred too. Did that then, with the advent of tolerance, especially from the political sense going on in Europe in the 18th century, is that, and the writings certainly of for better or worse, the writings of Voltaire and writings of Locke are and certainly of Mendelssohn too, but and of all the intellectual of the time, these ideas of tolerance subsequently give way to the Jewish secularization? Is that how that happened, or what are the origins of Jewish secularization?
Yeah, okay. Again, this is another big question. I dedicated the old book about it, titled "The Origins of Jewish Secularization." So, to make this long story short, I first of all, I agree. The atmosphere of tolerance, of course, could encourage processes of secularization, and the attitude of the state towards the community. The policy that, for example, I gave the example of the French Revolution,
Right.
that Jews are not even allowed to be part of a community anymore. They could be individual citizens of France, for example. That's also, of course, contributed to secularization. But I believe that secularization in the 18th century was one of the most significant processes among 18th century Jewry. It was a big challenge. It is a challenge until today. I'm, of course, aware that talking about secularization in our time, the 21st century, is very dangerous,
Yeah.
because the postmodernist criticism already put the entire notion of secularization in question.
Yeah.
And justly, I think the criticism rejected what we call the secularization thesis. That means the narrative or the idea, or maybe the vision of the decline of religion, because religion cannot exist in modern conditions. But this, of course, was unproved by history and by reality. But as an historian, I believe that we cannot ignore secularization as a very powerful force. And in very, very short, I said it in my book, but I have three main arguments. I think that the dominant channel of Jewish secularization was acculturation. It means when Jews in Central and Western communities, Central Europe, Western Europe, in those communities like Hamburg, Amsterdam, London, when they were tempted to be part of the fashionable public, to be fashionable Jews. It was sometimes very simple, by acquiring European languages, by dressing as the others in the Baroque or the Rococo fashion, because men and women, fashionable men and women, wanted the freedom for their body and mind. They didn't want to be under religious supervision anymore. They didn't want to rebel. They didn't want to abandon the community. They wanted to be, again, acculturated, but they behaved in the way that rabbinical leaders already saw as intolerable and permissive behavior. So this is the dominant channel, I believe. And the second channel, that's changes in Jewish thought. We can start with Spinoza from late 17th century Amsterdam, and then going to the 18th century, when we can already encounter Jews who were defined by themselves or by others as free thinkers, those who became skeptic about religious thought, ideas, principles, and they became lax in their commitment to the commandment. One of the prominent among them was the Jewish philosopher from Lithuania, Shalom, who also wrote an autobiography, and he showed us his way from religious community, even Hasidism, and then a believer in Spinoza in a certain way, something between deism and atheism. And the third pattern or third channel of secularization I've already mentioned, and I'm going to repeat because it's very important to my mind, and that's the emergence of the Jewish intellectual, Jewish secular intellectual in the Haskalah, in Jewish enlightenment. This figure, this type, social type, who challenged the rabbinical elite, who wanted to introduce the reform plans in Jewish culture, education, and others. Again, this secular intellectual was secular not because his way of life or his belief.
Right.
Because as we understand today, secularization is not just about losing your belief in God. He was secular intellectual from the social point of view.
Yes.
Because he wasn't ordained as a rabbi. He didn't belong to the rabbinical elite, so he was secular. He didn't derive his knowledge and vision just from religious texts, but from many other sources of inspiration. So those three channels, acculturation, free thinking, and the secular Jewish intellectual, I believe that those are the main challenge of Jewish secularization already in the 18th century.
That's very impressive. And you can see that throughout the periods too, building up, and throughout each challenge, each event, but also each pushback. You can see that building up. I said, as we have spoken of, the idea of tolerance being a contributor, being a contributor to the idea of secularization broadly, but specifically for within the European Jewry. And within Judaism too, the idea of the secular Jew. It's a huge shift, and really over seemingly not that large of span of time too. When you look at that span of time, it develops very quickly. It develops through other factors, through other things that are emerging in Europe. So it's a very fascinating topic, which I think, again, just like Haskalah, not enough understanding by non-Jews who don't grasp this period and how of a great impact, monumentous impact, not only in Europe, but subsequently, and I would say not only for the European Jewry, not just for the Jewish community globally, but for everyone subsequently globally. These were rippling effects that we subsequently have in our world today, and subsequently even secularism is an effect. We still strive to understand what does that mean to be secular in modernity.
Okay, so this is the question because I.
Oh no, I think the last question I was wondering is what did the beginning of the Jewish, I know I'm going to pronounce this improper, the Kulturkampf. What did that mean? What did that mean for the Jews?
Yeah, okay. I mentioned it at the beginning that this is a German, of course, term taken from the battle between church and state in Germany in the time of Bismarck. So that was called Kulturkampf, and of course I bore this term and try to bring it into the Jewish context. It's not exactly the same, but I wanted to emphasize the power of division.
Right.
that happened already in the 18th century.
Very good point.
And of course, the impact is with us today too. And as the challenges to traditional Judaism, to traditional communities, rule of the rabbis and many others became, more and more prominent.
Right.
So we may say that two main camps were created among Jewish society. From one side, the modernists, those who believe that Jewish society needs all those reforms in order to be part of the modern times. And on the other hand, those who were more conservative and who believed that every innovation, every change is dangerous, it's threatening not just religion, it's threatening the collective identity of the Jews. It could bring to assimilation, it could bring to losing entirely the connection to tradition, to
Right.
the holy text, to the language. And they, in a certain point, became Orthodox. Orthodox, or Jewish Orthodoxy, as we understand it today, this is a modern innovation. Orthodoxy emerged in late 18th century as a new phenomenon. And this is sometimes very difficult to understand because the self-definition, the self-notion of the Orthodox themselves is that they are the only one who continue tradition, when all the others actually abandoned it or changed it completely. But they are the authentic Jews. But historically, this is an entirely modern phenomenon. It happened as a reaction to secularization, as a reaction to modernity, reaction to enlightenment. And Orthodoxy as a movement, as a denomination, is something that didn't exist before. So this is the main impact, I think, of the Jewish Kulturkampf from the 18th century until our times. And of course, describing two, contradicting camps is not so right, because in between, you can find on the broad spectrum also mixed options.
That's a good point.
There are liberal Orthodox, there are modern Orthodox, and so there are varieties of Jewish identities, but still the division between the modernists and those who reject modernism is something that was created in late 18th century, became more prominent in the 19th century, and it's still with us today, because there is no one way to be a Jew, and there isn't, of course, something that we can say authentic Jews. We are all today, all the Jews who live today in the world they are all modern in a certain way. They are all the creation of modernity.
Right. That's a very good point. It's a very, very good point there. It's a very good point. Would it be then almost inaccurate to say, when people say casually, would it be inaccurate to say that there are, the Jewish community, but would it be more accurate to say Jewish communities, because there is so much variety? There is so much variety. That is a very good point too. I mean, this has been a very fruitful conversation, which, I feel you have contributed to my enlightenment in my thoughts here. So I really appreciate this conversation. But it's very rich and deep. We take for granted the complexity, not just of being a human being, but of the complexity of any faith, of any ethnicity, and of any person too. I mean, and this shows you the ambiguity. I mean, right from Mendelssohn onwards, from our discussion, that you can be exponentially many things at any given time. There's so much a one person can be. I wonder too, as a final question, Professor, what for my audience, for those who are a non-Jewish community, for non-Jewish individuals, what for a person who is not Jewish, what do you think should be more widely known and understood about this period of Jewish history? I would say everything should be more widely understood, but but what do you think should be something that people should hone in on and really strive to understand more, and perhaps maybe understand, in so doing, understanding that period of Jewish history, understanding these conflicts better, understanding why these have come about through historically?
Well, I thought about this question a lot, and it's a very good one. And I don't often have the opportunity to speak about it. But let me say the following. I believe that it's important to understand that the Jewish people today lives not just under the trauma of the Holocaust. Of course, the trauma of the Holocaust was the most terrible thing that could happen to any nation, and especially to this tiny minority of the Jews. We started 1700 with 1.1 million, but on the eve of the Holocaust, there were more than 16 million people Jewish people in the world, and today there are only about 16 million. That means since the Holocaust, the population didn't increase enough to, right, to reach the number of the Holocaust. And of course, this trauma affects on the daily life of the Jews, I think, all over the world, and even affects Jewish politics and Israeli politics, because this is a politics of surviving. It's about survival. So we have the picture of the Holocaust all the time in front of us, and and our politicians and policy ideologies and ideologues and others, we aspire to one thing,
right?
To be very careful in order to avoid something like that to happen again. But as I just said, the Jewish people live not just under this trauma, but also under the impact of the encounter between the Jews and modernity starting the 18th century. So the Kulturkampf is a lasting battle, and the dilemmas of Jewish identity that we inherited from the 18th century are still with us. The two camps that I've just mentioned, the modernists and the anti-modernists, the secular Jews and those who are still continuing the religious revivalism of the 18th century, like the Hasidim. So it's important to know that the Jewish people is divided between liberals and humanists and conservative and radical nationalists, and this is also a kind of a bleeding trauma. If I may, I can give you an example from today. Just today, a member of the Israeli parliament, of the Knesset, who is the leader of a radical right-wing religious party, came to Britain to visit, and the official leadership of British Jewry, Board of Deputies, declared that he should leave. He is not wanted here. We don't want a racist with terrible ideas that we, British Jewry, cannot tolerate, because this is a contradiction to the values of Judaism as we understand it here in Britain for many, many years. And they called him a disgrace for Judaism. a very radical, untypical, not something that we would expect from this kind of criticism is not heard, not loudly at all in Israel. But now, our brethren in England were more brave to say it. This is one example. Another example, we in Israel still carry with us a political trauma, and that's the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin in 1995.
Yes, yes.
And it
I know
is considered a political assassination, but we should know that the killer was a religious person, consulted Orthodox rabbis before he committed this terrible act of murder. And he believed that by killing the prime minister, he is actually serving God. So this is a very, very radical, of course, expression of the Jewish Kulturkampf. That's part of it. So all those things are still with us. The heritage of 18th century is with us. And I wanted to conclude my answer to this last question with another quotation from Moses Mendelssohn.
Please, yes.
He wasn't a naive philosopher. He already saw that rationalism is not necessarily going to win. And he said the following in one of his last letters from 1784. He said the following: "We dreamt of nothing but the Enlightenment, and believe that the light of reason would so intensely illuminate the environment that delusions and enthusiastic fanaticism could no longer be seen. But as we can see from the other side of the horizon, nighttime, with all of its ghosts and demons, is already falling. More frightening than anything is that evil is so active and potent. Delusion and fanaticism are acting, while reason contents itself with talk." Thank
Beautiful.
you. So said Moses Mendelssohn.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. Professor, it has been
to our time.
one of my favorite reads. I said he long ago I became a fan of his writings and just my own intellectual pursuits, and just it's an intellectual journey to discover this. And I think anyone who, certainly someone who's not Jewish, should really strive to understand this period. It is such a fervent, and so much things are going on. So much is going on in Europe. So much is going on with the European Jewry this time. But on a final note, I have to say, Professor, it's been an absolute delightful conversation to have you on here today, and I look forward to hopefully having you on again in the future to discuss another topic. But it's a pleasure, and I thank you very much for your discussion today.
It's a pleasure being with you today, Matthew, and we'll keep in touch.